Hello and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And this week I'm really happy to welcome onto the program Chelsea Steinauer-Scudder. Chelsea, thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And it's been great getting to know your work. I've seen some of your stuff over the years because some of the folks that you've written for, like Emergence Magazine, are things that are very close to what the Forum on Religion and Ecology is about. And so you're a writer and at the confluence of relationship to place with experiences of the sacred. So it couldn't be more relevant to the field of religion ecology. And you have a master's of theological studies from Harvard Divinity School. In case anybody hasn't heard of Harvard, it's kind of famous. And you've
Don't
worked
hold
as
it
a
against me.
you've been an editor and a staff writer for Emergence Magazine, and you've been published in a lot of other venues. And most recently, you published this wonderful book, Mother, Creature, Kin: What We Learn from Nature's Mothers in a Time of Unraveling. So, definitely excited to chat about the book. I've been reading it, and it's one of those books that's so well written it makes me angry. So I'm like, why didn't I think of this? Uh, and so it's great. But before that, I'd like to hear a little bit. I know the book includes a lot of autobiographical and personal reflections, but I want to take a step back even further. How did you get into an approach to like religion, theology, the sacred that was also about place, nature, the environment? Because of course, for those of us who do this work, it's very intuitive and obvious, like of course. But still to this day, the mainstream approach to like the environment is to think about science and technology, policy, activism, and the religious side is often missing. And likewise, when people think about religion, they're still thinking about some otherworldly transcendence. They're not often thinking about the body, place, earth, the universe, etc. So, what was your kind of personal path into that intersection?
Yeah, so I grew up actually in a very secular home. I'm Jewish on my mother's side, but we weren't really practicing. And my dad is, I don't know if he would call himself an atheist, but definitely strongly secular scientist. He is a botanist and plant ecologist. And so I really grew up with a very strong environmental and conservation oriented upbringing. My dad is a pretty hardcore conservation guy, sort of in every aspect of his life. So, yeah, the first sort of moral lessons I remember learning as a child were all about how to be in good relationship to the planet and my dad taught us really how to be outside, how to be paying attention, often in ways that as children felt very tedious and boring, but now of course, I'm very grateful for it. And yeah, and so really as a plant guy, he really brought us into that world with him. And my brother and I grew up helping him on research plots. And there's a story that could be apocryphal, but might be true that we had to come with him to one of his botany classes at the University of Oklahoma once because he didn't have childcare lined up. And he asked some question like, what is photosynthesis? And none of the college students raised their hands, but apparently my brother and I in the back were like, we know. And so I think in some ways that was sort of my religious upbringing, just in terms of having a very strong moral foundation that I was raised with through my father. And then my mother is, yeah, she's a spiritual person. I don't know if she'd call herself religious either, but she's an artist and has a background in natural sciences as well. And so she sort of brought in this creativity and this, yeah, I feel like she gave me sort of my sense of joy and wonder at being outside. And so I really grew up secular for through my teenage years. And it was in high school that I really started to become aware that we were surrounded in Oklahoma by this pretty fervent Christian culture that I was starting to learn more about I had a few friends in high school that wanted me to convert to Christianity, and I ended up just becoming actually through those experiences, even though the conversion attempts were a little bit painful and off-putting, I really came to have a deep interest in learning more about religion and spirituality. And so that's what I ended up doing in undergrad. And as I was coming out of undergrad at the University of Oklahoma, Oklahoma was entering into this very contentious moment of all of this anti-Sharia law, anti-Muslim
Uh,
sentiment that had sort of built up post 9/11. And the religious studies program was very involved in doing some interfaith dialogue. And so I got really interested in comparative religion as a way to work on social justice issues and human rights issues, and went on to pursue that at Harvard for my master's degree. I still hadn't thought to connect the two, religion and spirit and ecology yet, but I got all the way through my master's program and sort of finally in my mid-20s had this realization that those two things could be braided together, which in hindsight, I wish I had focused a bit more on that in my studies. But um, yeah, I sort of remember this moment of realizing that just in my personal life, the way that I connect to wonder and the sacred and a sense of something greater than myself, a sense of mystery, is through place and through being outdoors and through being in the living world. And so I started to get curious about where I could find people and organizations that were working at that intersection. And yes, eventually found my way to Emergence Magazine and my way into writing. And that's sort of where I've been ever since, which is, yeah, an ongoing exploration of both how other people are doing that work with spiritual ecology, but also what that means for me. And yeah, this book sort of this was really my first deep dive personally into writing about that for myself.
nice. That's wonderful. Yeah, I like how the religious side of things and the conservation and place-based awareness side of things were both kind of growing gradually. And then finally you're like, oh, wait a second. I think these actually intertwine quite a bit. Uh, and I have to say, I'm always envious of writers because as an academic, if I write something, it gets put into like an anthology that costs like $140 and things like that. And so it's not, which isn't to minimize what academics do, but I always appreciate people who are on the writer side of things a little bit more than just the academic side because the way you're able to communicate these ideas that reaches such a broad audience. And without dumbing it down, too, I've really enjoyed the book because there's references to great poets and novelists and philosophers and things like that, and just peppered throughout, but in a way that isn't just beating people over the head with big ideas and terms and things. So, really appreciate that. It's inspiring to me. Um, so let's talk about it a little bit. Mother Creature Kin. Uh, I really like this topic, what we learn from nature's mothers. And I know part of this was inspired by you yourself becoming a mother. And so, which I don't have kids, and I have a bunch of friends who do. So I'm kind of like a uncle to people and things like that. And it is one of these big questions, especially for people around like our generation and even and younger, is what's it like to bring kids into a world when you know and are experiencing ecological collapse? So I wonder if you could say something about that kind of background, because that's a very existentially intense thing. It's like I'm bringing another person into a world that I know is very difficult to inhabit.
Yeah. So I think for me, absolutely becoming a mother sort of confronted me with all the work I still, just even in a personal way, needed to do around climate crisis. And I think there are all kinds of ways that we can enter more deeply into that work. It doesn't have to be that we become a parent, but for me, that was kind of the impetus of prompting me to look more deeply at the things that were, for me, a little bit easier to turn away from when I was an individual living my own life, writing about these things and feeling like I was engaging, feeling like I was going there sort of emotionally and intellectually. And then my daughter, I was about 3 months pregnant when COVID lockdown happened. And so I think just even experiencing my pregnancy and birth in this moment that felt so uncertain and unstable and that sort of ushered me right into so many of the ways that I had not engaged as deeply with my climate grief, with my fear, with my anxiety, with even with my deep love of place that because that flip side of grief is a really deep love and that's a vulnerable place to go. And so I think just the vulnerability of becoming a mother and realizing that I am not going to get to control whether or not my daughter becomes an adult in a safe, healthy world and starting to feel the stakes rise as I have been, yeah, just even thinking again, thinking about things I thought I had sort of come to terms with over the last few years and realizing I had more work to do and grappling with this question of in the face of this deep uncertainty, how do we raise a child? How do we be in service to that child's world? And how do we start to widen what it means to care for others? Because we're not individuals and we are part of this interconnected community of people and of creatures and of ecosystems. And all of that has to come into play to ensure that our children have a sustainable future. So that was yeah, that became kind of the deep dive for me.
Well, and I really appreciate that in such a deep struggle with things like our grief, our love, our fear, and our anxiety, that it doesn't take much to look around and be like, oh, well, there's lessons all around us. And there's like the whole living world is ready to give us its wisdom. And so you find so many different ways that mothering and caretaking and things like that are exemplified in the natural world. Because I think it's easy to forget that, especially those of us who are kind of alienated from place. If you're living in suburbs or a dense urban environment, it's easy to kind of forget that the natural world is there and it's ready and it's willing to teach us. And and so it's important to remember that. And there's so much solace that we can take in nature. And uh, well, and also I appreciate that mothering for you isn't exclusively women's work. And you talk about, the whole idea that men who are practicing a lot of caregiving and raising a child, that their brain functions very similar to a woman doing the same work. And so mothering isn't exclusively for women, and women aren't exclusively for mothering. And so you can still be a full human woman and not be a mom. So you deal with those issues really well. And yet, there's a word I haven't caught in the book. And my wife does a lot of work with feminism, ecofeminism in particular, and she calls it the F word, feminism. And you do mention, a couple times you mentioned the feminine, and you do quote Donna Haraway about the role of feminists right now. And speaking of how you bring up great philosophers, Donna Haraway is one of my favorite people of all time. So it's in there a couple times, but for the most part, not coming up. So I wonder, where is feminism for you?
Yes, what a great question. I haven't been asked that yet. So, great question. I feel, I guess from my perspective, like feminism, even though I don't say the word it so much in the book, is sort of woven throughout this book, just in terms of putting forth this call to embody a form of caregiving and nurturing that is community oriented and that is um, reciprocal and that is connected to our roots and our earth. And in that sense, to me, it's a very sort of ecofeminist book. And yeah, it was interesting as I was starting to do my research. I I started reading more about ecofeminism and some ecofeminism articles and texts, and just ended up really finding myself feeling drawn to the, I just kept getting pulled back again and again to my sort of religious studies roots and the sense of comparative religion and really wanting to dig into, I guess, just examples of that rather than sort of dwelling too much on expounding upon feminism. I think part of it is just, I feel like so much of that work has been done in a beautiful way, and I was wanting to just move forward or continue this other direction. But um, yeah, I love Donna Haraway as well. She sort of helped articulate my sense of what it means to have these companion kin and companion species and start to think of this idea of mothering in this non-gendered, more expansive way. And so, yeah, I do hope the book reads as feminist, even if I don't use the F word very much.
Yeah, yeah, I think it definitely does. And it's just one of those things. Sometimes the best way to talk about something isn't necessarily to use that word, because people have all kinds of opinions about what feminism is, and that could kind of slow somebody down and be a bit of a roadblock in terms of engaging with what you're talking about.
Mhm.
So it's a whole question. It's like you hear from climate scientists, or they're like, sometimes just don't even mention climate. Talk about energy, talk about the cost of living, talk about how we love our kids, whatever it is. But sometimes these words just activate something in people. And so it can be kind of dangerous to say something like feminism, or ecofeminism for that matter. But yeah, to me, it definitely read as a feminist text. Uh, but again, that could mean so many different things to different people. But I appreciate it, and especially this episode will come out just before Mother's Day.
Mhm.
So I appreciate it. I normally don't have a designated Mother's Day episode, but I feel like this is a great one. And especially because on Mother's Day, we often are only honoring our biological mothers, our human mothers, and we forget how many different kinds of mothering there are in the natural world. So let's talk about it because you find mothering all over the vast panoply of life on Earth. So I don't even know where we should start. Maybe let's start with the smallest stuff, because
Okay.
you talk about some microscopic mothering.
hmm Yes. So one of my favorite sort of surprises in writing this book was learning about these single-celled organisms that live in all marine environments, but I learned about them as I was researching salt marshes, and they live in the peat and in sort of the brackish waters of our salt marshes. And they're called foraminifera and forams for short. And they're incredible. So yeah, single-celled. They have these cytoplasmic arms that they can extend around themselves to move and to feed and to construct these tiny shells that become their shelters and their homes. And they have super bizarre ways of giving birth and creating the next generation that it's like randomly they can reproduce sexually and then asexually. They can just sort of dissolve themselves into a million globs of genetic material. And their shells become fossilized and have been super important for our understanding of where the oceans on our planet have been over the last 500 plus million years. And so they're they're incredible. I think I was so fascinated by them, not only because they're so tiny and strange, but also because they inhabit these incredibly narrow ecological spaces. They're very particular. Each species has its own very sort of narrow niche. And um, so I think there was just something in that to me about, I think, climate crisis can feel so big, so overwhelming, so abstract that it was sort of a breath and a relief to read about these creatures that inhabit such a small world and sort of do their their work and they're reproducing and they're living in that space and still are part of this vast story about our planet that, they're sort of witnesses to each of their moments in time and each of the changes that are happening in their time. And it just gave me some, I think, a sense of agency and groundedness to think that the work we're doing, sort of whatever scale we're on, can still be that important work of witnessing and of being where we are and with the time we're in. So yeah, so those were look them up forums. They're beautiful and very bizarre.
Yeah, right. I like the bizarreness of it. The idea that you can just switch. We're like, you know what? I'm going to reproduce asexually right now. And later, it's time for some sexual reproduction. Just flip flop like that. And a great example, so much research on the queer ecology, and that's such a good example of that, where it's like sex in the natural world is so wild and strange and so much more than some of our rigid norms make it seem like. Uh,
Yes. And I think it
and
just helps us break out of our forms of thinking that we sort of can assume are true or permanent, or, that just helps us, it shakes us up a little bit and helps us remember that the things the ways we define ourselves are, constructed, and there are so many other, other ways out there to, yeah.
right? Yeah, especially ways like that are so old.
Hmm.
And it's like, well, you guys have survived mass extinction events.
Exactly.
And so if you can do that, then climate change easy.
Yeah, they'll be
We can
fine.
definitely, yeah, we're going to be just fine. And just learn from those kind of survivors and the bizarre habits they have. Like, all right, if they can do it, we can do it.
Yeah.
So I like that. I like learning from the tiny things, especially like
Hmm.
you're saying, climate change and things like they're so big, so abstract, and it's sometimes really good to narrow your focus and learn from the small stuff out there. And then you start realizing that small stuff really does matter.
It does.
And in a world where everybody wants like metrics to show how impactful you are, and you're like, sometimes it's not going to measure, it's not
Yeah,
going to show impact. But in the long run, we're building up to
exactly.
that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And it's just such a good reminder too that even the work we're doing, even, just being in our gardens or breathing our air, we're interacting with life on all of these scales all the time. And so even just remembering that the tiny is all around us all the time, and those forms of life are part of us as well. But yeah, it's good. A good reminder.
Yeah, I like that a lot. Uh, well, I don't want to. It's always tough talking to an author because the whole thing is don't spoil the book. Um, so, a few hints here and there to different examples. Um, but another thing I appreciate is that because it's easy to learn mothering lessons from things that are very similar to us. You could look at like chimps or, any of the great apes. But you're looking at things that get pretty different from us. For instance, microscopic organisms, but also marine mammals
Mm.
and which are mammals like us but different because of the marine part of it and because of the size. So I know you talk about whales a little. I wonder if you could share a little bit. Again, not trying to spoil anything.
Yeah. I'll try, yes, I'll try to leave some mystery, but one of the creatures in the book is the North Atlantic right whale, which is a critically endangered whale species. And I came to know about them when we were living in Maine, and in a sort of very real way, North Atlantic right whales are losing females in particular as they are facing what's called an unusual mortality event, where more whales are being killed by human impact than are being birthed into the world. And so that in some ways just felt like a direct parallel to some of the things I was thinking about. But as I came to know more about them and then got to see some mothers and their newly born calves in coastal Georgia, I, yeah, I think the real learning about the whales for me came. It was really right at the beginning of writing this book. They were, because it was January, that was the time I could go see them. And so it was the first sort of big section of the book that I wrote. And it kind of cracked open the whole book for me because once I saw them, I sort of got out of my head of, I'd been doing all this research and reading scientific articles, trying to understand their plight, and kind of had a very intellectual understanding. And then seeing this mother and calf there on the water was such an emotional experience, and kind of this visceral experience of, I had this fear writing the book about anthropomorphizing and about not being, I think just from my scientific dad, I was really worried about not being objective and about projecting, and especially dealing with these themes of my own motherhood and all of that. And so encountering these whales, I realized that I sort of thought I was projecting onto them, but I was actually really having my one of my very first experiences of myself as a mammal, and I
Mhm.
think it like went the other way. And feeling this kinship with this mother whale who was nursing her calf, and I was still nursing my daughter, and just sort of realizing that we shared this, yeah, this mammalian ancestry that some, tens of millions of years ago we diverged, but we came from the same, um, long ago inheritance. And so, yeah, there was just a sense then that it wasn't just about learning about non-human mothers and what their ecology was and what their plight was, but actually finding ways to, again, kind of come more deeply into my own sense of vulnerability and of understanding just how precarious the situation we're in right now is, and then feeling like I think it just helped those whales helped me understand in kind of a tangible, real way for the first time that my daughter's well-being absolutely is interconnected to the well-being of other creatures, that wasn't just an abstract thought experiment, that really is literally true. And um, yeah, so I think seeing this whale child and knowing that it was heading straight into a really dangerous, sort of terrible urban marine situation, just drove home for me the same sort of echo of the feeling of sending my daughter into this uncertain future. And who do we need to be aware of? Who do we need to be giving our attention and our care to turn that around or to, you know, um, so anyway, so that was some of the whale story.
That's great. Yeah, and I appreciate the concern about anthropomorphism. That's a real problem, but I feel like the flip side of that is if we're always struggling to be so objective, we might then suck the soul out of the living world. And so, and then all of a sudden, then we become very anthropocentric, where we think only humans have intelligence or consciousness or sentience or whatever. And so it's a delicate balance, but I think, sometimes a little dash of anthropomorphism might help us avoid being really anthropocentric. And but it is one like, of course, dolphins aren't smiling. That's just the way their face looks. And so there's certain limits where, like, well, okay, now you're projecting. But yeah, I appreciate you're like, oh, I think it was actually going the other way, where I wasn't projecting on it. It was actually projecting itself into me in a certain way, and so you're actually receiving something.
Mm.
So yeah, I think that's really beautiful. And there's something about marine mammals, especially whales. They're so charismatic. So it's hard not to learn lessons from them. And such a blessing to get to see them and to reflect on the precarity of that species right now. So really appreciate that. So from the tiniest things to like the biggest things, then everything in between, you're finding so many examples of mothering. Of course, we had an episode come out recently. We were talking about plants, and so a lot of people have become aware of like Susan Simard's work with the mother tree. And so, how are plants figuring into the book? Because they mother as well.
They do. Yeah. So there's two sort of main sections on plants. One is in the salt marshes, looking at the sort of two main species of grass particularly in the New England salt marshes I visited. And then also, yeah, a little bit about forests here in New England and looking at Suzanne Simard's work and this idea of the mother tree. And so yeah, so starting with the salt marshes, yeah, again, I was interested, I guess, in salt marshes as this example of I wanted to know what we could learn from edge places, places that were kind of in the space of constant transition and change in a in a way that reflected for me this bigger moment that feels like, so obviously so much is shifting and changing and transforming, and it's sort of hard to find our footing in that. And so salt marshes are, yeah, right there at the cusp of land and sea, kind of these liminal ecosystems that are, the tide comes in and out twice a day. And so their whole way of being is in a liminal sort of transitional space. And so I picked up Rachel Carson's Sea Trilogy, which is so beautiful, and she writes about how we go to to the edge of the sea to find this elusiveness of meaning. And that just sort of summed up for me exactly what I was wrestling with was this feeling of wanting certainty, wanting answers, wanting solid ground, and just again and again and again, everywhere I turned, that was not available. And so the salt marshes for me became, yeah, just a really powerful metaphor, not only, I mean, a metaphor, but also just actual, some real practical learning from learning about that ecosystem, about what it means to be inhabiting this moment, even just in terms of sea level rise. And
Mhm.
so, and these salt marsh grasses are incredible because they can, there's very few, freshwater plants can't handle any saltwater inundation, but these salt marsh grasses can have all these special biological mechanisms for dealing with the influx of salt. And so anyway, so there's salt marshes and then the forests, and we have a 20-acre piece of land in Vermont that is recovering forest from, few moments of logging in the last 150, 200 years. And it's beautiful. And we've just sort of slowly been getting to know it and learning what's growing there and how to read that landscape. And so I was looking at forests as these examples of not only of community and of Suzanne Simard writes so much, as you know, about all of those, the mycelial networks and all the interconnection and cooperation that happens in forests, but also wanting to understand a deeper sense of sort of how forested landscapes, particularly in New England, are reflecting the history of the land and what has happened here, and wanting to know more about what it means to be participating now in this unfolding story, and forests as a way to do that. And so, yeah, and there was just so much, all kinds of fascinating things to learn about how just thinking about the time scale of forests and being on that centuries time rather than our human lifespan, and what it means to slow down and what it means to have restraint and what it means to have patience and what it means to not act on a landscape unless we are listening and paying attention and acting with knowledge rather than with our own assumptions and intentions that, yeah. So,
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's one of the things I've enjoyed about the book a lot is there's all these lessons about mothering, but also you can just read it in terms of our place on Earth and the different spatial scales, the different temporal scales, and so it's fun because it's you can read it in so many different ways. If you're like, look, I don't care about mothering anyway, learning so much about the different ways that different organisms interact with one another, interact with their environments, and then there's the side where we can get lessons from that. But I always enjoy that. It's just something about thinking like, okay, centuries time.
mhm.
That's a different way to think. And I don't
Yeah.
know, like the human brain isn't necessarily wired for that. We're really good at thinking about tomorrow or like what I'm gonna have for dinner tonight. And maybe at most, I don't know, a 30-year mortgage, but beyond a century, our brain has trouble firing.
Yeah, it gets
And
pretty tough.
yeah, it's just too much. But then it's like, well, you can get better at it. And it's precisely by meditating on stuff like this. And the more you learn about that, the more you can kind of stretch your imagination. And I think that's just one of the most important things we can do right now to respond to all of our crises, including social and political, but certainly ecological. So the more we can stretch our imagination, think bigger, we can have bigger plans. Then we might be able to be kinder to one another and some of those basic things, the golden rule. Maybe start treating others how you want to be treated and think, you can learn those things gradually.
Yeah.
Um, well, another uh, realm of the natural world that you bring up is birds. And this is one, like, I was never really into birds, even though I've been doing, environmental ethics and stuff like that for a very long time and really started as an undergrad. And somehow birds were never interesting. And then during COVID, I noticed birds because,
Mm.
I don't know why exactly, but, people, it's like you couldn't really do much else aside from go hiking. And for some reason, I just started noticing birds more. And where I'm at in Sonoma, California, there's a really great diverse bird population. So I started to get to know the birds and just really appreciate them. And it's just one of those things that just like, I don't know why. I don't know why I was blind to birds. And then once I started noticing them, including like, I know you had like an app that was for barn owls and stuff like that. And anytime you have a cam that you can go to see birds, like that's oddly entertaining to me now. And so now anytime I see birds, I'm like, oh, who's this? Or even just crows or something. People are like, it's just crows. I'm like, they're actually very intelligent. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about bird mothering.
Yes. So, first of all, I was also bird blind for quite a long time. I have so many memories of my dad ended up working for the Audubon Society for most of his
Oh.
career, which is very bird oriented, but he was always grumbling because he was a plant guy. So he would like get these calls about birds. He'd be like, I don't know anything about birds. Um, so yes, I came to birds a little bit later but it was really exactly through that of just having encounters with birds where I actually noticed them and then became curious about who they were and what they were doing. And so, yes, so one of those early examples for me was with this family barn owls that were neighbors to us when we were in Washington State. And there was an owl cam in the nest box. And so it made such a difference also because they're out at night. So we wouldn't just see them flying around during the day much
Right.
anyway. And so being able to click into this Owlcam app and just see them there. You don't, when you're out looking at birds, it's hard to get super close and just sit and watch them. And so that was a helpful entry for me for avian interest. I, and then they were raising their brood of chicks for the season. And it was in this moment where we had just moved to Washington and our daughter Aspen was just a year old. And so still relatively new to motherhood and also in this big moment of just practical life transition of moving to this new state and coming into this very unfamiliar sensory landscape. Very beautiful, but it felt very distant and hard to relate to, and all the things that come with moving of uprooting and trying to root somewhere else. And I was just sort of feeling this deep lack of belonging and kind of this growing almost panic about of just feeling the need to be rooted somewhere and feeling so untethered. And so it was a very grounding experience to watch this family of owls who was so at home, so of this place. And as I started learning about barn owls, I I just went deeper and deeper into my amazement of just how wired they are for their sensory environment. And so owls have this incredible sense of hearing. Their whole body is wired for sound, their shape of their face and the structure of their wings, and they they hunt in the night. They can strike a mouse that's running through tall grass in total darkness. And so um I was feeling a little bit envious maybe of these owls that were so tuned in and just wanting to understand what I think we often think of belonging in kind of a human cultural sense of our social network or our family or our cultural values. And I was really longing for just a physical sensory belonging, wanting to feel oriented, wanting to feel like what I was seeing and smelling and touching was familiar. And so I think, yeah, those owls just brought me into this kind of quest to figure out what that meant for me and why that felt so important and why it felt important to give that to my child. And again, I think from that came the sense of my sensory belonging and our sense of our sensory belonging as humans, wherever we are, is is fully sort of built into the places where we live, whether or not we're tuning into those senses or not. And so the sensory belonging of our non-human neighbors also really matters because those are the birds we hear, and those are the trees making our oxygen, and those are, the waterways and all of those pieces that come together to build that sensory world for us. And so, yeah, it was just one more example for me of, okay, I can think about my own sensory belonging, but I also need to think about how to make sure others are belonging and are in relationship to their ecosystem in a healthy way that keeps all of those systems thriving and working together so that we have the capacity to have those things become familiar and recognizable
Mhm.
and yeah, part of who we are.
Yeah, right. That our sense of belonging is so tied up with the way that all these other animals and plants have their own belonging. And yeah, great lessons in just interdependence. Such a simple concept,
Yes,
but living it is a different story.
really
And
hard.
yeah, it turns out it's really difficult. And I think that, I mean, I've been in the San Francisco Bay Area for about 20 years now and like grew up in Texas, born in Arizona, so really never had a whole lot of time to belong to a place. But in the time I've been out here, I've really tried to learn more of the plants, the birds, the mammals, the natural history of the area, the indigenous communities that are part of this landscape. And now I'm like, well, now I can't leave because starting over would be so difficult. Like, all right, anyway, it's Idaho for you. I'm like, I don't know that. And because it's, I get the concept of interdependence, but yeah, actually learning and companioning and making kin, like it's a long, long process.
Yeah, it's
Um,
really a life's work, I think. Or for me, it will be a
yeah,
life's work.
yeah, I think for all of us, but yeah, or for people who just want to ignore it, then it's not
Yeah.
a life's work. But I think increasingly people should do it, especially so many studies come in. It's like this helps our mental health and time outdoors, intentional time where you're learning about the plants and animals and ecosystems around you. That actually alleviates so many symptoms of depression and anxiety, ADHD. So even if you hate nature, like still go out there. It benefits you personally. So for selfish reasons, you
Yeah,
should still go and connect to the natural world around you.
absolutely.
Um, Well, so many great people. I already mentioned this, the poets and scientists, philosophers. You mentioned so many cool people throughout the book. And one that I really appreciate is Ursula Le Guin. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about what Earthsea means to you.
Yes, oh, gladly. I've just actually been rereading it the last few weeks
Oh,
and
nice.
finding always more to find in her book.
Hmm.
But so, yeah, so Earthsea is Ursula K. Le Guin's. There's actually four. I think it's often called a trilogy, but there's
Right.
four of them. And I think technically they're written for young adults, but I came to them as an adult, and I very much think they're also written for adults. But the main character is this, it's a land of wizards and magic and dragons, and the main character is Ged, who is a dragon, or not a dragon, he's a wizard. And the first book of Earthsea, also try not to give away too much about this book, but
Right.
sort of follows him as he comes into learning and knowledge about magic and how to work his power in relationship to the world. And in this universe that Le Guin has created, the whole land, the earth is infused with magic, and sort of the core of the power of the wizard is learning the true names of things, and the sense that once you know something's true name, you have a certain amount of control over it. And so the wisest wizard knows that you never act without full knowledge, and you only act when you absolutely need to. And so it sort of traces Ged's journey into all the ways he needs to be sort of humbled and educated about that relationship, which is so beautiful. And all of the books are wonderful. But we we were both reading, my husband and I were reading books as I was pregnant, and decided to give our parcel of land in Vermont this name of Earthsea after that series. And um, we started coming up with little places there that we've either named after places in the Earthsea books or places that have had special meaning for us there. And we had a friend create a map for us that sort of reflects the sort of accurate physical space of the land, but with these kind of overlaid with this imaginary um, landscape that we've sort of overlaid onto it. And so, yeah, I just became, as I was writing and starting to reread some of that and think about this piece of land we have, just, yeah, it was just a lesson for me, not only in thinking about that sense, of course, of the way we use our power and control. Obviously, a lot of parallels there to how we treat places and people who we have. Of course, I could go on and on about all the ways that's been damaging and destructive in our history, but also just thinking about what it means to bring imagination and creativity and a sense of possibility to a landscape and sort of what that can invite us into and also just all of the joy and fun and wonder that can come with getting to know a place. And so yeah, it was really fun. That was one of sort of the most fun parts of writing this book was sort of braiding together Le Guin's Earthsea with our now named Earthsea and thinking about, yeah, just what that means to get to know a place in that way.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's just one of those references where I always get excited when somebody brings up Le Guin. Her work's just amazing, and yeah, and I totally agree that the Earthsea books are definitely for adults. It just because they're accessible to young adults doesn't mean it's not for us old people.
Definitely.
And it's people of all ages. And it's just one of the things I think Le Guin was so good at doing was writing in a way where anybody can really find a way into it. And
Oh,
there's so many lessons to learn.
oh my gosh. Yeah, you feel like you're getting a full like moral education about how
Yeah.
to be a good human. So,
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's amazing. And I first read, I think it was Left Hand of Darkness
mm.
as an undergrad, as I was like a philosophy major. He's like, why should we read fiction? And then after that, I was like, oh, never mind. I didn't realize some of the deepest thinking that you can do is happening in works of like science fiction and fantasy and stuff like that. So yeah, and also really appreciate that like there's two different directions that you're kind of writing in. One of them is the way where people like Le Guin can inspire your relationship to land, and the other one is the way that attention to land can inspire your own personal storytelling. So it's like
Mm.
storytelling enhances your relationship to land enhances your storytelling. And so what a beautiful feedback loop. And so it's one of the things you can get out of the book is just all these great references to different thinkers and writers, but also all these great references to actual organisms and ecosystems. And all along the way, there's a sense of hope. I don't know, that word might be overused, but or courage or maybe fearlessness, but anyway, not wallowing in all the despair that's easy to wallow in. So I appreciate that, and I think anybody reading it will easily pick up on what I'm saying.
Mm.
And how old's Aspen now?
She's now 4.5. Yeah.
That's great because I know that in the book you said, it kind of starts with like your first trimester and then all the way to her being like 3. It's like, well, and it takes a long time for books to get published.
Yeah.
And so I was guessing, I was like, I bet she's not 3 anymore.
No.
4.5 is not too bad. 5, then it's like, okay, somebody needs to speed up the editorial process here.
Yeah. I did have a moment. I remember being like, oh my gosh, she'll be heading into kindergarten by the time this is coming out. But yeah, but
I'll be
yes, she,
curious what she thinks of the book eventually.
yes, me too. Yeah, right now it's been fun to talk to her about it. She's been very supportive and she's at this age where for us, it's like, in some ways, she's like so intuitive and perceptive that I forget she's 4. So I was like trying to sit down with her and trying to be like very touching. And I was like, so look, it says for Aspen, in the front of the book. And she like looked over at the box of books and she's like, so all those books are mine? It's like, well, no. But yeah, she's so sweet. And yeah, she's probably the greatest teacher of all the
Mm,
many great teachers in this book has probably been her for me, just in terms of a human, children are just such wonderful examples of our capacity as human beings of just unmediated relationship with the living world, and
Hmm.
it's just what it is. There's nothing put onto it. So
Yeah.
she's
That's
been
yeah. That's really beautiful. I like that. You're like, the dedication doesn't mean that the books are actually yours. It's like for you, but not your property. She's like,
Let's
okay,
talk
I don't
about belong.
understand.
Yes.
It's like you writers, you're too complicated.
I think she would agree with
That's really sweet. I would hope that at some point she'll reach an age where she's like, Mom, this is so embarrassing. Why did you write about me?
that.
It's more like the preteen years, maybe.
Yeah, I know. I
Uh,
was trying to think the other day, like she'll probably like really sit down and read it when she's like 28 or something, and not,
right.
but we'll see.
That's really sweet. Well, I wonder, always curious, what's next? Do you have plans or just, obviously this book, get more press out, tell everybody about it. But, you might have something else kind of in the works.
Yeah, great question. So I've been sort of tinkering for the last few years, even before I started writing this book, on I think it will be a book eventually about the grasslands and the prairies of Nebraska and Oklahoma, where I grew up, and particularly Nebraska, where my family is from a few generations back, and thinking a bit about this narrative arc of, yeah, my family arriving in Nebraska as part of the great settlement of the plains, which came with so much uprooting and
Mhm.
destruction and loss of, cultural diversity, plant biodiversity, everything. And then, yeah, just thinking about my father and both of his brothers all became prairie ecologists who have sort of dedicated their lives to restoring that ecosystem. And I think just wanting to look more closely at, yeah, all of those legacies and stories we carry with us, and how we can make that turn towards healing and repair, but using this time sort of being grounded in the Great Plains and the history of the grass. I'd also really like to focus on the history of the grass itself, and what how humans have come to landscapes, how I guess how the history of the landscape itself has drawn people and sort of shaped that history in an entwined way. So something like that will be the next
Nice.
project.
I like that. And again, it has that kind of integration of history, ecology, and that personal touch. So yeah, I really, really love that kind of storytelling and appreciate anybody who's going to honor grasslands. Something about grasslands, people are like, look, if it's not a lush forest, I'm not interested. And or tide pools, there's certain things that people are so excited about. And then grass being, it's just grass. I'm like, you might not know the whole story of grass. It's actually pretty amazing.
It's really amazing.
Yeah. And like,
Yeah.
it doesn't look that interesting. Like more is going on than you might know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I appreciate that a lot. Well,
Um,
geez, has been great. You'll have to come back when the next book is out, and we'll
thank
chat
you.
some more. And maybe at some point we'll get Aspen on the show, see what she has to say.
She'll have a
Uh,
lot to say. Yeah.
that's great. But thanks so much. So again, the book Mother Creature Kin: What We Learn from Nature's Mothers in a Time of Unraveling. Can't recommend it highly enough. And to end the show, one of the things I like to do is have the guest just give one word or phrase, and I feel like it's kind of mean because that's a burden. Uh, and and sometimes people are like a phrase, especially writers and academics, are like I'll give you like a paragraph, or just one really long run-on sentence. So whatever it is, give us a word or a phrase, or it can be a complete sentence, but anything that you feel called to say, and that will take us out for this episode.
Okay. Well, without any context, and I'll just invite you to look it up. I'll just say the word incendence, which has been a revolutionary word for me, and not my word, but yes, incendence. I'll leave it there.